It was a Thursday night, around 11 p.m. when I saw the light. I was sitting in my office on the second floor of my rural home, working on an audit report for a small electronics company, when a light in the sky caught the corner of my eye. I turned just in time to catch the light trail of the meteorite as it blazed across the sky. It moved so fast I wasn't sure how I caught it in time. But there it was, streaking across the moonless sky and burning brighter than all the stars around it. And just like that, it disappeared over the horizon, hiding in the undulating terrain of Washington's channeled scablands, but only for a second or two. Then, there was a brilliant, bright flash that lit up the landscape, followed by a bang so loud you'd think the universe had popped like a giant balloon. And then silence. A deep silence best reserved for the coldest days of the year, when the air holds so still that even the jackrabbits hold their breath. Quite the opposite of these active nights of the dog days of summer. The initial boom was so loud, I leapt off my chair in fright and scanned the expansive foothills. I was ready, but for what I did not know. Nothing moved for what felt like an eternity, and then slowly, nature resumed its chattering noises, starting with the crickets, as if they held domain over the sagebrush and coyotes. I went back to work, a tad shaken, but I was sure to get all the details tomorrow from the algorithm. We're rural out here, but not completely alone. Someone will have something to say, I'm sure of it. A busybody neighbor, the town gossip. Someone will ask because they need to know the answer. Days went by, and asked they did. Of course, all the nearby folk had their theories and stories to tell. From one end of White Bluffs, Washington to the other, they all had their stories to share. Some with pictures, and others in the comments section. But I kept to myself and just read on from afar, trying to stay in the know. The topic of the White Bluffs boom, as it became to be known, had one final spark of interest, and that was when a state university found the impact site. But beyond flattened and superheated sand, very little meteorite debris was found. After that, interest in the topic began to wane as life kept on moving and the earth kept on spinning. Another, seemingly unrelated incident occurred a day or two after that. And that was a report from the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. A report of a mutilated pack of coyotes. No one's going to cry any tears over the matter, as coyotes were nothing more than an opportunistic nuance and fair game to a hunter with a rifle at any time of day. No. What was strange was that someone or something took their legs, and only their legs. That was the night before the writing man appeared. I'd spent most of the evening drafting another audit report when an odd noise caught my attention. If I'd been playing music or watching TV, I might have missed it. Faint jangling, like a loose bicycle chain, followed by the squeal of dry metal begging for oil. While either of these noises may not be odd in some denser parts of the country, even this late at night, it could only mean one of two things out here. The writer either had a death wish or was trolling for an easy score to feed their methamphetamine addiction. In either case, the jangles and squeals grew louder, as whatever it was steadily drew closer and closer, making it harder to ignore. Standing up from my desk, I opened the blinds and peered through the slots to the streets below. Outside, the lights casted an elongated oval of yellow light onto the street, illuminating the road beyond my grass, giving it the appearance of a stage, a look which was only further emphasized by the two evergreen trees at the edge of the lot. Suddenly, a wheel bobbed forward, kissing the light before rolling backwards into the darkness. It teased at first, but after two more bobs, the noisy wheel rolled forward fully into the light, bringing with it an ensemble of oddities. Emerging from the darkness was a large and lengthy man sitting atop a rusted unicycle. His arms and legs were bent like a spider's, and he continued to bob to the center stage at the pace of two rolls forward, one roll back. Now, a figure riding a unicycle in the dark would have been strange enough, but the fact that he wore an elaborate clown outfit made it a tad over the top. And even though he wore bright colors, like the yellow suspenders which held up his wide-waisted rainbow pants, there was nothing bright about him. Quite the opposite. Dirt and grime dulled his colors, and dark, cloud-like mystery spots covered his body, staining polka dots and stripes alike. Then there was the way he moved in exaggerated and uncoordinated movements, like stop-motion claymation from the age before CGI, a la 1992's Army of Darkness. What took the cake, however, was the galvanized steel bucket he wore over his head. While it was the same type of bucket found on most farms, it was painted with colorful doodles of flowers, farm animals, and the sun, save for his face. Even though his eyes were nothing more than simple black ovals and dots, they followed me as he moved. They were menacingly aware and alive, as if made possible by a trick of the paint. Finally, there was his mouth, drawn in a wide, open-mouthed smile filled with rows of sharp white teeth, caped in barn red paint. Without this odd mask, this whole weird encounter could have been chalked up to kids practicing their best Pennywise impersonation before Halloween. That would be something borderline familiar, something normal, something manageable. But this was something else, something much worse. Pangs of panic gripped my heart as the grotesque figure rolled into the center of the road and looked up at me. I wanted to turn away, to pretend it wasn't real, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place, rooted by the novelty of the situation. He was an actor on the stage, and I was his unwilling audience. Once he reached center stage, he reached into the darkness of his waistband and pulled out the bloody leg of a coyote. He held it by the ankle and tossed it in the air, spinning the leg like a baton before pulling out another, and another, until 4 of them were spinning through the air. Once all 4 legs were spinning in the air, the riding man began to ride his unicycle around in a narrow circuit. As he rode, a deep and ominous giggle emerged from beneath his bucket, crescendoing into a cancerous roar that pierced my ears and knocked me out of my stupor. Dropping the blinds, I stumbled away from the window. I felt tainted for having watched the riding man's display outside, cursed to remember it and wishing to forget. But it was his laugh that cut into me, making me feel dirty as if mucked by the darkness it carried. I opened the blinds again to see if he was still there, and there he was. Except this time, he was balancing a leg on his nose. That's when I dropped the blinds and dialed 911. A county sheriff's deputy arrived within 30 minutes of me making the call. Not too bad considering there's only a handful of deputies patrolling the unincorporated county at any given time, whose responsibilities also sometimes include supporting local PDs when needed. The fact that they showed up under an hour was nothing short of a miracle. However, at the time and in the moment, anything short of instantly materializing out of thin air was too long of a wait. Luckily, the emergency dispatcher stayed on the line with me the entire time, even though she made it clear she was skeptical about my claims. Maybe it was the calmness of my voice, or my description of the riding man outside my window that influenced her judgment, but it was clear she had her doubts. At least that was my understanding from the way she casually reiterated that making false 911 calls constituted a crime. Unfortunately, while I was on the phone with the emergency dispatcher, the riding man disappeared without making a sound. No more laughing, no chain squeak, or so much as a single pebble crunch. Things didn't get much better when the sheriff's deputy arrived either. He practically laughed in my face when I told him my story, chuckling as he scanned the road for any signs of the riding man, any evidence that might give weight to my words. Instead, he found nothing more than sun-bleached beer cans and discarded fast food wrappers. Proof not of my story, but of how little people give a shit when they think no one else is looking. In the end, he left me with nothing more than an arched eyebrow and an empty promise to check out the road in the direction the riding man came from. Coincidentally, the same direction back into White Bluffs proper. The whole interaction left such a bad taste in my mouth that I didn't even bother reporting the coyote leg I found in the ditch the next day. I don't know how the deputy missed it, but sure enough, there it was, across the street from my house. The flies are what caught my attention, and while the leg was well into 48 hours old, it looked different, aged or tainted almost, like deli meat left in the back of the fridge for 6 months. 2 days passed, and even though I was still a bit shaken from the incident, life goes on. The world turns, and More audit reports come in. I couldn't complain, though. I welcomed the stability of the monotony, something I immediately missed once my life went topsy-turvy. I almost felt safe after those 2 days. That is until I overheard a clerk and a customer at the hardware store discussing coyotes and rabbit fencing. I recognized the man in his torn-up red flannel and dirty blue jeans from a road or so down the way from my place. It was a freshly retired farmer who took to raising meat rabbits and selling them at the farmer's market on Saturday mornings. I ignored them at first, resigned to my device as I verified some measurements on a piece of pipe I needed to fix my upstairs sink. That is, until the farmer mentioned his dead rabbits. Hovering an aisle over, I pretended to browse brass fittings while the old farmer described finding his rabbit pens torn open, and their bodies mangled into an indiscernible bloody mess of fur. Their little bodies distributed out over the entirety of their 8x8 sized pen. "It's odd, though," the man said grimly. "I've never known coyotes to leave the meat. All they took was the intestines." "Just the intestines?" asked the clerk, bewildered at the old man's story. "In fact, once I noticed I couldn't unsee it. The bodies were there, their hearts and guts, but no intestines. It's the damnedest thing." I left the hardware store immediately after hearing the old man's words. Even then, I couldn't get them out of my head. Just the intestines. As much as I wanted to deny that the writing man was the one behind the rat massacre, I knew it was him. I don't know how, but I did. And the more I told myself to quit being so paranoid, the more I dreaded the setting sun as it clung to the last few minutes of daylight. I glanced down from my office window, down at the writing man's stage, which seemed so innocuous in the daylight. I wondered if he'd be back tonight. But again, instinct told me he would, as surely as the summer winds call to the birds as the seasons change. The hours and minutes ticked by as the sun drifted beneath the western horizon, casting long shadows and throwing golden rays of light in the air. My right forearm ached from tapping my finger against my desk as I leaned back in my office chair and watched the road morph into the writing man's stage as evening creeped in. It was turning out to be a beautiful autumn evening, one I filled with unfocused work and fueled with reheated chicken thighs and white rice for dinner, which did nothing to distract me from my thoughts. I spent the rest of the evening bouncing between a template on my screen and the empty street outside. At 1 a.m. exactly, I could hear rubber flopping on asphalt, followed by the same high-pitched squeak of a dog's toy from the street below. I peeked over my monitor, and there he was, this time waddling out of the darkness to take center stage. I stood up from my seat and watched from above, well lit and unobstructed. Someone with a bit more sense may have kept the blinds shut, but even though I was afraid, I had decided it was better to hit this head on, to see where it goes. After all, if I were going insane, I figured I might as well embrace the experience. He wore the same bucket as before, doodles and all, but now his clothing was different. Instead of striped pants, he wore dingy yellow spotted pants and a black vest over a button-up shirt with an exaggerated collar and cuffs. And while he also wore a set of white gloves, they were stained dark, the color of mud and rust. Or maybe even the color of dried blood. Hard to say. The writing man then bowed forward with a raised glove thrown high behind him, which in turn displayed a painted eye atop his bucket helm, an eye painted the same barn red as his teeth. The eye stared as he bowed, and I felt uncomfortably seen, but instead of turning away, I stared back. After holding his pose for a handful of seconds, the writing man leapt back and danced an elaborate dance, leaping about the stage with the same jerky and uncoordinated movements as last time he performed sans unicycle. The whole scene was surreal, and the grime that clung to him gave it a ghoulish tint. But there was something about the way he moved that began to connect or feel like something other than just a taunt, as if there was a point to all this, but understanding was just out of reach. Maybe that was just me grasping for straws, but why else me? Why else was I cursed to witness whatever this was, if not to understand it in some way? Then, the writing man started to cough. He stopped mid-leap and stumbled while he hacked and coughed beneath his mask. His body trembled and his back heaved as he stumbled forward before resting on his knees. I grimaced as I waited to see what grotesque trick he had prepared, and from the sounds of it, he was preparing to vomit razor blades and bowling balls. But it was clear from his hyperbolic movements that this was all part of the show. The writing man then kicked his head back and clawed at his throat with both hands before he reached into the underside of the opening of his helmet. With his right hand, he yanked out a single red handkerchief from beneath his helm, squeezing it as he pulled. Dark bile oozed through his clenched fist, staining his gloves even more as he extended his lengthy arm out and pulled at the fabric. However, instead of a rainbow of multicolored paisley-patterned hankies, tied to the end of his handkerchief were the small intestines of an animal, which in turn was tied to more intestine. Knot by knot, foot by foot, he continued to pull out what seemed like an endless tether of bile-covered intestines and coiled them on the ground in front of him. Once the entire thread was out and steaming in the cold night air, the writing man stood up at attention, coughed once more, and then bowed. And like before, we stood there in silence, feet apart, that is, until his laugh began to crawl out from beneath his painted helm. It started as a giggle, but quickly filled the air with an eerie cackle. That's when the power went out, followed by silence. It went on like this for some time. The writing man would appear and put on his grotesque show before vanishing into the desert. Sometimes the lights would go out, only to flicker back to life seconds later, with no sight or sound of the writing man. Or sometimes, he'd simply ride away silently, which in some ways was more disturbing than his sudden disappearances. He'd casually, albeit slowly and silently, sulk away into the darkness until his next appearance. There was also no pattern to his appearances, at least none that I could discern. Sometimes I'd hear about his prep work through the grapevine. A mutilated flock of birds a few roads over, or strange roadkill found about. There really was no limit to his reach when it came to creature, and for the most part, had these mutilations been spread out, they might have flown under the radar. That is, if not for the abundance of bodies in such a short time span. Thankfully, he didn't seem to have an interest in humans. At least not yet. One night, I ran downstairs to confront the writing man face to face. I opened the door and made it within feet of him before realizing I had lost whatever advantage I had from the second floor. As this close, it was much more intimidating than I expected. There was also a strange smell about him, like cat piss and musty dirt. Without skipping a beat, he reached into the bottomless hobo bindle he'd been performing with, and pulled out horse heart after horse heart, pretending to be puzzled by each one as they dropped to the ground. As I watched, there seemed to be a twinkle in his painted eye, almost as if he took pleasure in having me there front and center, no longer separated by vinyl siding and a two-pane glass window. Then, there was the night he threw animal testicles in the air and swallowed them one by one, only to cough up a goat fetus. And after that, there was his performance with a makeshift set of bagpipes made from a cow's stomach, each note played in the key of screaming bovine, while my blinds did nothing to block the sound. Worst of all, no matter how loudly he played, his laugh always seemed to rise above his performance. I'd always find something the next morning, a prop or keepsake from the writing man. Sometimes it would be in the ditch or on the road, but there's always something left. Something left behind and covered in his vile black rot. The sheriff's office stopped taking my report after the third night. On the fourth, they wrote me a citation and threatened to throw me in county if there was a fifth. I could also tell they suspected me of something. After all, mutilated animal parts kept showing up on my doorstep. But out here, animal parts could be found in just about any field or lot. So without proof, we were at a standstill, legally speaking. I tried to ignore the writing man for a few nights, hoping he'd move on. Instead, I'd find my home vandalized with that night's prop. I'm still sickened with how many crow's beaks I found in my mailbox from that first night. Confronting or killing the writing man had occurred to me, but so many questions swirled about in my head that it didn't feel like an option. He was clearly not human. His body was too oddly proportioned, and his tricks were too fantastical to make sense. But then if he weren't human, what was he? Where did he come from? What did he want? And why did he choose me? More importantly, was I going insane? Maybe I was just afraid and looking for a way to justify my hesitation. But eventually, wrestling with the whys began to drive me mad. My thoughts were consumed by this oddity, and eventually my stress began to bleed into my life outside the home. I became sullen and reserved, unfocused and consumed as I spent my days scouring the internet and books for some type of answer, but finding nothing even remotely close to the writing man in history or folklore. At some point, I stopped sleeping. I was always somewhat of an insomniac, but this was different. Before I could rest, even with my unorthodox sleep schedule. But now there was no rest. With my situation compounding, my friends began to take notice and my family grew concerned. The few I confided in doubted me. I could see it in their eyes, but at this point I wasn't sure if I even believed myself. Eventually, a longtime friend reached out, worried about my well-being from the stories I'm sure he'd heard. I told him everything. And most of all, I told him I could prove it to him that the writing man was indeed real. It just needed one night of his time, within 24 hours of the next mutilation. He agreed. However, as the tail end of summer turned into mid-October, the writing man didn't show. I scoured the algorithm for any reports of mutilations, but found nothing. For a couple weeks after our agreement, there was no sign nor sound of the writing man. Then one day, my friend disappeared. I felt sick to my stomach and dizzy when I heard the news. I knew the writing man was behind my friend's disappearance, which did nothing to help my sanity. However, I also felt ill because my intuition told me that the writing man would be back that night, back to perform one of his disturbing displays. I don't remember the time he arrived because time was quickly becoming an abstract thing at this point, but I'm sure it was at or after midnight, as that seemed to be his preferred time. This time he wore the same outfit and rode the same unicycle as the first night he appeared. Once in position, he reached into his wide-waisted pants and retrieved a set of collapsible poles. He wobbled as he connected them, making a show of it as he worked. Once the frame was complete, he draped it with a black tablecloth, also pulled from his pants, making a mini stage or table. The writing man then tugged at something strapped to his back, but it playfully snagged on the first tug. After the second tug, there was a loud tearing sound, which I can only describe as Velcro made of flesh. However, once I saw what the writing man had, I didn't give a damn about any sound. The bundle pulled from his back was a torso and sticks wrapped in greasy rope. But it wasn't just any torso. It was my friend's, or what was left of him, as his head, right arm, and everything beneath the navel was torn away. The writing man fiddled with the torso and sticks before dropping it over the mini stage, then proceeded to make it dance while circling around on his unicycle. While the image of my friend's entrails dangling beneath his torso was quite shocking, what hit me the hardest was how his lungs were torn out his back. And while they were still attached at what I assumed was his windpipe, they hung high over his shoulders, giving the appearance of a Viking blood eagle and marionette. The sight was so surreal and traumatic that even today I still see it burned into the back of my eyelids. Something inside me broke that night. I felt my spirit pour out like water from a shattered ceramic basin hitting concrete, spilling out in a great splat and taking my sanity with it. I didn't even hear the writing man's laugh that night. After the show was over, the writing man packed up his props, torso included, and drifted off into the night, leaving me at a loss for words or actions. My best friend was now just another prop or product of this morbid and twisted creature who was surely the devil incarnate, because every other explanation seemed to fall short. A day or two later, well before I even had a chance to fully process the events that night, the first child disappeared. It started with the grade school kid down the street. He was the first to go missing. I vomited when I first heard the news, and try as I might to convince myself that the boy's disappearance was completely unrelated to the writing man, I knew the truth. Unfortunately, some of that truth included that I was responsible for the boy's disappearance. Not directly, but also in a way, directly responsible. I was responsible for letting whatever the writing man was fester night after night. Instead of acting, even though it became clear that this would not end, only escalate, I sat back and watched, complicit in my watching and waiting, my waiting for someone else to handle the problem. While I still had so many questions about the writing man and why me, I now realize that I'll never get any of those answers, no matter how entitled I feel to them. What I did know was that I could no longer be a spectator. 2 more children disappeared before I felt that strange pang of intuition that preceded the writing man's return. That afternoon, I went to my bedroom closet and dug out an old Remington 870 shotgun from the back of my closet. The shotgun was older than I, but the cloth sleeve it had lived in for the last 15 years kept it dust-free and in working order. I didn't hate guns, but I also didn't explicitly like them. I was indifferent for the most part, but knew how to use them. At least, this one. As I held the shotgun in my hands, I thought again about how easy it was to do nothing at first, to be stupefied by the strangeness of the writing man and his acts. But with the firmness and weight of the weapon in my hands, I found myself feeling awake for the first time since the whole ordeal began. Awake and prepared. The sun started its descent beneath the horizon around 5 p.m. that night. The nearby trees and houses casted long, tendril-like shadows across the landscape as the setting sun drifted further towards the western horizon. I watched from my office window with a cup of coffee spiked with Irish whiskey. The black liquid warmed my body, while the alcohol burned the back of my throat and steadied my nerves. Outside, birds chattered while a rabbit disappeared into the vacant field of wild wheat across the street from my house. I glanced down at a murky puddle in the driveway, formed by the rain the night before. The water was black and almost as dark as my cup of coffee, but instead of a void, it reflected the darkening sky above back to me like a mirror. As I gazed into the puddle's reflection, I thought back to something I read long ago about the ancient Mayans. About how the Mayans would chart and study the movements of the stars and constellations by looking down into puddles just like that one, jotting down celestial movements to find patterns in the chaos as they tried to make sense of it all. I realize now, looking back, that the thought came to me because I too hoped to find some semblance of meaning from this experience. That there was some reason behind the madness of the writing man. Then again, maybe I just needed something else to think about for 5 minutes. After another healthy sip of coffee, I put the mug down and retrieved the old Remington from beneath the window where it sat leaned against the wall. It felt good in my hands and sturdy, refreshing my resolve to do something instead of just waiting for something to happen to me. In total, I had 2 slugs and 12 rounds of buckshot. I wasn't sure which would be more capable of putting down the writing man, so I loaded in the 2 slugs first, followed by 4 rounds of buckshot, and prayed that would be enough. And there I waited until 12:45 a.m., when I first heard the high-pitched squeak and jangle of the writing man's unicycle. The noise easily carried into my open window, as did a cold air as the writing man approached in his unhurried way. He meandered without a care as he rode onto center stage. Then, as he had done so many times before, he bowed and watched me from behind that singular painted eye atop his helm. The writing man then shot up, charged and ready to perform, but instead of waiting to see what horrors he had prepared this time, I picked up the Remington. The blast was so deafening that for a few seconds, all I could hear was a high-pitched ringing in my ears. My right ear took the brunt of the blast, and I felt a little concussed from firing in such a small space, but I had to press my advantage, so I pumped the shotgun action and brought the second slug into battery. I looked out my open window and saw the writing man sprawled out on his side next to his unicycle. While he didn't move or twitch, it was clear from the black ooze forming around his head that I hit him. Before I could make my next move, the writing man's arm twitched, followed by a leg and the cracking of joints. His body shifted and twisted in unusual angular ways as he peeled himself up and off the ground. Ripped into where his left eye was once painted was a large, smoldering bullet hole, and from it squirted black, tar-like blood. The writing man gurgled as the wound pulsed, and a thick black organ flopped out the hole. It spasmed and licked at the sides like a cow tongue protruding from a sheet metal fence. Before he could fully get off the ground, I fired the second slug into his side. The impact spun him in the air and splattered globules of black tar all over the street. In a stunning display of resilience, the writing man then popped up from the ground and twisted midair to land on all fours in a crab walk position. He flicked his tongue before pointing it at me with its fleshy tip as black bile oozed out the sides. He let out a hiss and then waddled towards my home with surprising speed. Pumping the shotgun again, I racked in a round of buckshot and sent the volley right into the center of the aluminum bucket. The thin metal tore apart like tissue and revealed a writhing mass of black tongue-like organs of various sizes, but all connected at the base where the writing man's neck should be. Few of the damaged organs fell to the ground, but were quickly replaced by new ones as the mass wiggled and pulsated from the assault. Badly injured, the writing man let out another shriek before attempting to retreat to the field across the street. His movements were frantic, causing him to stumble and fall into the ditch along the road. I'd come too far to let him out of my sight, so I did the only sensible thing I could think of and jumped out my window and onto the roof of my porch. My adrenaline was jacked, and while my knee threatened to give out as I dropped down from the porch and onto the ground, I ignored it and pressed the attack. The writing man continued to stumble as he crawled, hissing and shrieking at me as he moved through the reeds, but leaving a trail of black ooze so dark that it glistened in the faint light. As I followed, a musty aroma smell filled the air, with a sharp and synthetic topper on it so potent my eyes began to water. As I caught up to the writing man, the smell was so overwhelming that I wanted to retch, but I couldn't stop. Not now. So I fired another round of buckshot into his chest as he crab-walked backwards. The writing man shuddered from the shot, but still flailed about like a wounded animal. So I fired another round into his chest, except this time, blowing it open. Had he been a man, I'd be staring at organs minced into hamburger, but instead, there was a gelatinous goo and strange muscle tissue that tensed as he struggled to move despite the damage I had inflicted. While he/it appeared still alive, I could tell it was dying. The mass which made up its head slowed its writhing down and produced a strange gurgling noise as the ground around it darkened from being saturated with the creature's blood. I felt numb to all the existential questions that the existence of this creature brought to the table, and I certainly didn't even feel triumphant, just numb. All I could think about was how he killed my friends and those missing kids who were surely dead. Why had this thing entered my life? What did it want? Twisting and ruining my sanity, and for what? Nothing. I wanted answers, but I knew I wasn't going to get them. However, I was okay with that, because at this point I was done with answers. I just wanted this fucking thing dead. Taking aim with the Remington, I gazed into the darkness that was once its face as my shadow covered it, and pulled the trigger. Then again, over and over again, until I heard a click. Then I set the field on fire. By the time the police and the fire department arrived, the entire field had been engulfed in flames. At the time, it felt like the reasonable thing to do, but in hindsight, it may have been a tad overkill. The sheriff had plenty of questions for me, but I had no answers for him. I may have been half mad at the time, but I knew my rights, and without any proof directly linking me to the fire, mutilations, or disappearances, there wasn't anything anyone could do. As for the writing man's body, it disintegrated into a black mass on the ground where he fell, staining the earth through the ash. Still, as I stand here at my window almost a full year later, watching the same shadows casted by the setting fall sun, I can't help but find my way to the stain on the ground where the writing man had died that fateful night. The stain left by that strange creature who had invaded my life for no other reason than the fact that I was home. And while I can take some pride in putting an end to it, the world around me seems different. Or maybe I'm different now. Thinking about it now, as I stare at the dark patch not 50 yards from where I stand now, I think I understand those mains a little bit more. Maybe instead of trying to find meaning in the sky above, they were really looking into those dark puddles below to find something within themselves. Maybe by looking into the darkness long enough, they learned a bit more about themselves. I know I did. For even though the writing man is gone, he will forever remain a part of me, because just as he stained the earth below, my soul too has now forever been tainted by that experience. For better or worse, only time will tell. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the audio presentation of The Writing Man. I wrote this story about a year ago as part of a daily writing habit, and like so many of the other stories I wrote in 2024, I wasn't sure where it was going or the direction it would take, but I hope you enjoyed it. At first, I wasn't so sure about this story being my first audio production, because the stories I write aren't limited to the horror genre. In fact, lately I've been writing a lot of sci-fi and post-apocalyptic fiction. The Writing Man felt like a good literary fingerprint, something which was uniquely my style, at least according to ChatGPT. Well, I pulled some inspiration from Stephen King's It. Mostly the Writing Man's clown-like appearance and his appetite for fear. Most of the story was based on my view of current events and my experiences in the deserts of the Pacific Northwest. I'll bet nothing as fanciful as this story. Again, thank you for listening, and if you'd like to hear more of my work, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Alternatively, if you'd like to read more of my stories, which will also appear as future productions, you may visit my Substack at washingtondry.substack.com. This has been a Washington Dry radio drama. This story was written, narrated, and produced by the author, Washington Dry, with music provided by Carl Casey at White Bat Audio.